Our application is going to use two application load balancers. If you're not familiar with application load balancers, or if you're maybe just a little rusty, let me give you a brief overview. Application load balancers, or ALBs, can load balance HTTP and secure HTTPS traffic, which use TCP ports 80 and 443 respectively by default. But it's possible to override the defaults and use any TCP port you want. An ALB listener receives a connection from a client, and it proxies that connection to an instance in a target group using a round-robin approach. The ALB can monitor the health of the target instances and remove from the target group any instances that are unhealthy. For example, if the application on one instance crashes, the ALB can detect that and remove that instance from the target group so that it stops forwarding traffic to the failed instance. An ALB listener comes in two flavors: internet-facing and internal. Internet-facing means the ALB gets public IP addresses and a public DNS name, making the listener reachable via the internet. We are going to use an internet-facing load balancer for our web tier. An internal listener is not reachable via the internet. It gets private IP addresses and a DNS name that can be resolved only within a VPC. We'll use an internal listener for our application tier. That will ensure that only the web tier instances can communicate with the application tier instances. All right, let's take another look at the app stack template. Before we look at the load balancers, there's one more thing I want to point out about the nested network stack template. On line 41, the network template referenced here is stored in my S3 bucket. Now you have two options here. One, you can use the template that's in my bucket, in which case you'll just leave this URL as is. Or two, you can upload the network-stack.json template to your S3 bucket and then put that URL here. Now, if you want to make any changes to the network stack template, you will have to use option 2. My advice is to go with option 1 and make sure you are working in the US East 1 region. All right, please, let's jump over to line 90. This is in the resources section. This is where we define the internet-facing web tier application load balancer and load balancer listener. This load balancer is going to proxy requests to the instances in our public subnets, our web tier. Notice that it references two outputs from the network template, the subnet IDs of public subnets A and B. This ALB is going to have one elastic network interface in each public subnet. All right, look near line 100 now for the web tier ALB listener, right there. Notice that this listener is going to use HTTPS and listen on TCP port 443, so it is going to require a TLS certificate. Hence, we need to specify the Amazon resource name, or ARN, of a TLS certificate in Amazon Certificate Manager. Now recall that we created one of these earlier. CloudFormation is going to look at the parameters section for this ALB certificate ARN value. Let's jump up to line 5. Now where it says default, you will need to put the ARN of your certificate, which you can get with a simple AWS CLI command. Just go ahead and open up your terminal and do an AWS ACM list-certificates. And there is the ARN. Just copy and paste it into the template, save it, and you're good to go. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And there we go. Now, while we're looking at the parameters, please go to line 31. Here's where you specify the name of the SSH key pair that you can use to secure shell to the instances. You, of course, will want to change this to your key pair. All right, let's go back to the web tier load balancer right around line 90. You control what traffic is allowed to ingress or enter the load balancer using this web server security group resource, which is defined on line 248. Let's jump to 248. Now this security group allows inbound traffic to TCP ports 80 and 443 from any source. It also allows SSH traffic on port 22 from the CIDR specified here in the SSH location parameter. Now we'll attach the security group to the internet-facing load balancer that's listening on TCP port 443. And we're also going to attach it to the web tier instances themselves, which is why we're allowing SSH access on TCP port 22. So this security group serves two purposes. Also, the application on the web tier instance listens for HTTP connections on TCP port 80 so the security group will also allow connections from the load balancer to the instances. All right. Now, if we go to line 120, this is the web tier ALB target group. It's going to load balance the connections to our web tier instances on TCP port 80 using HTTP, and it's also going to perform a health check every 10 seconds. The health check will send an HTTP GET request to each instance and look for the HTTP response code 200 OK, as in the web server is OK. It's working correctly. If an instance passes its health check, the load balancer sends traffic to it. Otherwise, if it fails its health check, it is removed from the target group until it passes a subsequent check. All right, jump over now to line 279. 279. This is our internal application tier load balancer. To reiterate, this is an internal load balancer, not an internet-facing load balancer, so we will not secure it with a TLS certificate. The internal load balancer is connected to both private subnets. One other thing to note, right around line 292, the application running on our app tier instances is going to be listening on TCP port 8080. That's 8080. You can see that the listener listens on TCP port 8080 as well, and it proxies connections to our application tier instances on the same port number. All right, one last thing with the load balancers. Go down to the outputs section on line 416 and expand it, please. Now, once CloudFormation creates the internet-facing load balancer, it will output the ALB's public DNS name. Once you deploy your stack, you'll be able to use the AWS CLI to view the URL of the internet-facing load balancer. You can then take that URL, paste it into your web browser, and that is how you will access the application.